One and live. Good evening. This is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives, and it's Tuesday at 8:02 p.m. Our topic for tonight is Our Future, Our Fight. And our guest is Dorothy Gasque, who is running for Congress in the Washington 3rd Congressional District. And she's going to start us off tonight by talking about the context for her race for Congress and the motivation that brought her into this fight. Okay, Dorothy, it's yours.
Hi. I'm running in Washington's 3rd Congressional District, which is Southwest Washington. It's a 10,000 square mile district, largely rural, with Vancouver, Washington being the urban epicenter of the district. And currently the seat is held by a Republican, Representative Jamie Herrera Butler, who, like many of the Republicans, has not held an in-person town hall in over a year now. She seems a little fearful of her constituents, but she's pretty vulnerable going into this election. I jumped into the race in particular because I'm a combat veteran. I served in Iraq in 2005. I was already in the military in 2001. My son was an infant when we went to war in Afghanistan. He was 3 when I deployed to Iraq. And later on this month, he will be turning 17. And we are still at war. And wars should not last for a generation. It is time for Congress to take back its role of declaring war and peace and start talking about how we can get lasting peace.
Yes, I entirely agree. But just apart from your concerns with respect to foreign policy, and war and peace, you also have a platform which is very extensive. And I should add to this, are you a Justice Democrat, I wonder?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and you're also you are a brand new Congress member as well.
Yes.
And you tell me that you're about to sign the CFAR.
I actually just finished
Well.
filling out the form.
Oh, you just finished filling out the form. Okay, and I know you're also a member of the 116th Congressional Coalition as well. I think that you were newly made a member just a day ago.
Yes.
As I recall. Okay, since I was who invited you in.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay, thanks for the context of the race. What I'd like to do now is to go through your platform in some detail, and I'll be asking you questions, okay, from time to time and making some comments on it. So could you start us off with the American Anti-Corruption Act and your ideas for getting money out of politics?
Well, the reason why it's at the top of our platform, and it's actually our highest priority issue, is that the corrupting influence of big money in politics is the single greatest threat to our democracy. It is the thing that prevents us from being able to have legislation that benefits the people. Right now, corporate lobbyists have more influence over our representatives than we do. And that's wrong. That's a broken system. This is supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And as long as money determines whose voice is heard, then that isn't the case. And so the American Anti-Corruption Act aims to end political bribery and create transparency and fix our broken election systems. The biggest piece is really getting rid of the ability of lobbyists to donate to federal candidates and to bundle for them, because that creates a conflict of interest, and that needs to be eliminated.
Okay, and more generally, your other ideas for getting money out of politics?
Well, I think the American Anti-Corruption Act, it's comprehensive anti-corruption reform policy, and so it really covers everything that needs to be done in order to create more fairness in the system, which would allow us to get people into office who aren't beholden to the money, and then we can get things like a constitutional amendment to be able to overturn Citizens United and have a system that functions long-term and protects those things that were put into place and then removed. So the battle against money in politics was first fought coming out of the Gilded Age. It was Teddy Roosevelt's big policy. And then in the 1970s, they started deregulating to prevent corporations from having too much influence over our politicians. So it's just really kind of cementing in those things that they took out and then using a constitutional amendment to ensure that it can't be undone again.
But while you're in Congress, there may be from time to time by campaign finance laws that will begin to surface once again, in hopes that Congress would be able to devise such a law so that it would be able to get by the Supreme Court. Would you vote for such a law if it surfaced?
Yes, I will vote for influence of money in politics.
Okay, so for any law that gets money out of politics, you are committed to voting for it.
Yes.
Okay, now if such a law tries to limit the contributions of the corporations, it's very likely it would fail the tests by the Supreme Court, and they would probably declare that law unconstitutional.
Yeah, I think that's why I like the American Anti-Corruption Act so much, is because it's tested against the Constitution. It's written by constitutional lawyers from both nonpartisan legislation, and it really gets to the core issues. I mean, there's things like I can't take money from a federal contractor, but that federal contractor can hire a lobbyist who can then donate to my campaign. So it creates a loophole in laws that we already have. So
yes, right, and not only donate to your campaign, okay, but if you stick with your position unfriendly to the lobbyist, okay, and the donor, the lobbyist, then they can donate to the campaign, okay, of your opposition, and see to it that your opposition is elected, okay, and not you. So there is that. So they have not only the positive power of actually bribing people, but the negative power of punishing them if they don't accept the bribe.
That is true. We heard it from we heard it during the tax cut debate, where donors were threatening the Republicans if they didn't vote for the tax cuts, that they wouldn't donate to their campaign and that they would support their opponents.
Very loudly and very publicly, as I recall. Yes. And very arrogantly, considering that we're supposed to be a democracy. Okay, but
yes,
have you ever heard of the exceptions clause to Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution?
No.
Well, okay, the exceptions clause is just a phrase in Article 3, Section 2. It's a rather short phrase, but it gives Congress the power to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And when Congress, in other words, okay, is passing a law, it can specify that the Supreme Court doesn't have the authority to hear an appeal concerning that law. And since the Supreme Court, okay, is just an appellate court, okay, it doesn't have original jurisdiction. It would not then be able to declare that law unconstitutional. So I guess my question is, if a new campaign finance law were to appear, and it had such an exceptions clause in it, would you vote for such a law?
Oh, I don't know. I don't like the idea of using something like that. I feel like the checks and balances are there for a reason, and
and so do I. And so do I. I believe they're there for a reason as well. So what I want to point out to you is that the exceptions clause was placed in the Constitution by the framers to provide a check on the judiciary, which was conceived of, okay, as an aristocratic branch of the Constitution. And the framers put that clause in there so Congress, which was supposed to be the democratic branch of the Constitution, okay, or at least the House of Representatives was, okay, to give the democratic drive in the constitutional pulse of the Constitution some power to check the Supreme Court in case the Supreme Court was running amok. So I put to you that since the year 2000, our Supreme Court has actually run amok quite a few times. And so I ask you the question, if this is not an appropriate context, and an appropriate time to use the exceptions clause, then what could possibly be? In other words, how far would the Supreme Court have to go to trigger this check, which is a written part of our Constitution? I'd also point out that the ability to declare federal laws unconstitutional, in other words, the judicial power that was seized by John Marshall in the early days of the Supreme Court, is not written into the Constitution. It's an implied power that was created by the Supreme Court's own interpretation of the Constitution, John Marshall's interpretation of the Constitution. Now, it's become custom over a period of time, and we've come to respect that, but it is not a written part of the Constitution, whereas the check that I'm talking about in Article 3, Section 2, that is a written part of the Constitution. So anyway, that's just some food for thought for you.
Yeah.
Okay?
I will definitely take that into consideration.
Okay, I make that case. Okay, so you are for Medicare for all.
Oh, yes, it is the fiscally responsible choice in ensuring health care for everyone.
It is definitely the fiscally responsible choice. Could you say a few words about why you consider it the fiscally responsible choice?
Because it would reduce our cost per person by half, and on top of that, save taxpayers an additional $1,600 per person annually, while covering everyone, providing them with dental and vision, and improved mental health care based on just what everyone else around the world is paying for the same services. And with the economy of scale, because we have such a large population, we can probably even reduce that even more.
Okay, so let me ask you a question or two concerning that. What we spend in total on medical care, in other words, when I say we, I don't mean just the federal government, but the private sector as a whole, spends $3.4 trillion per year now. I guess it's something like 17.6% of our GDP.
Yep.
Okay, at this point. You suggested, I think, I heard you suggest, okay, or perhaps I'm inferring something you did not actually mean to say, that could be cut in half.
Yes.
Okay. So if the cost as a percent of GDP, okay, and also as an amount but per year, but could be cut in half, then how is it that only comes out to $1,600 per person? In other words, it seems to me it's far more. Because
it is. So in private funds, we spend about $5,000, a little bit more per person, and in taxpayer money, it's about $5,000 per person, right?
Yes,
so it's like
I think that's very close.
Yeah. So Canada spends about $1,600 less per person in just taxpayer money. So if we're just comparing what we pay already from our public funds to what Canada pays from their public funds, they spend $1,600 less than us. So that's just from taxpayer money. It's not just saving all of us money, it's saving the entire system money.
Okay, so when you said 1,600, it did not count the amount of money that people in the private sector would save as a result of a Medicare for All bill. And so that's what counts for the discrepancy between the $1,600 and the $5,000
Yeah.
would actually represent 50%. Okay, so I have another little detailed question. Okay, to ask you about that. Okay, Canada spends about 11%. Okay, GDP compared to ours, 17.6. So if we spent as much as they spent, that would not be a 50% savings. In other words, it would be more like a 40% savings, or something like that. Okay, perhaps even a little less than 40%. Okay, so that's a little bit of a discrepancy. I think I may know where you got the 50% from, because Stephanie Kelton, in one of her broadcasts, I seem to remember, offered the possibility of that we might save as much as 50%. Okay. Okay, and while I respect her but tremendously, okay, and her economics but tremendously, I've always thought that she was a bit wrong there. That most probably, the savings would probably come down to more like something similar to what Canada has, because we are so like Canada as a culture. Okay, so I reasoned from that, well, most likely we'd still spend a lot compared to some of the other countries. We wouldn't be spending the close to 18% that we're spending now, but it probably would get down to 11 or 12% or something like that. Roughly a third savings. Now, I'm not in any way trying to deprecate that. That would bring down $3.4 trillion in spending to something like 2.2 trillion, or 2.1 trillion, and that would be fantastic, okay, for all of us. And it would mean that money would be in our pockets, because one way or another, since there's no deficit spending when it comes to medical care, all of the expenses for medical care come out of our pockets. We pay taxes to offset the government's spending in medical care. We pay the premiums, we pay the co-pays, and we pay the deductibles from our pockets. So we pay everything. So that saving of 1.1 to 1.2 trillion goes to the private sector. And that would be great to have that money in our pockets rather than in the pockets of the murderers by spreadsheet who run the health insurance companies. Okay.
Yeah. And it would increase economic growth.
It would. There was a study done by the California Nurses Association in 2008, I believe. It was announced at the beginning of the Obama years in 2009. And since then, the California Nurses Association has gone into the NNU. So they're part of the NNU now. But anyway, the econometric study, which is the only one that I know of here in this country, showed that 2.5 million net but new jobs would result from the version of HR 676 that was current at that time. So that's an awful lot, okay, of new jobs. Now, I should add that there are many economists, okay, at present who don't agree with that, who think that a Medicare for All bill would actually be deflationary, and some economists that I greatly respect also. But I think they're wrong about that. I'll stick with the only econometric study that has so far been done, in terms of the estimate, right now. When I talk about Medicare for All and the advantages of it, I always like sooner or later to bring up the fatalities issue. When you campaign, are you bringing that up?
Honestly, it hasn't been something that was really all too necessary. Most people, someone who wants universal health care for everyone, and I think because it's in the back of their minds that people are dying every year because they either don't have insurance or they're underinsured. And that, I think what the number is, like 48,000 a year. That's only people who aren't insured, and nobody's really calculating the amount of people who put off getting care because they can't afford the insurance that they do have, with the average deductible being in the 4,000s now. It's a lot of money to have to pay out of pocket if you get sick.
Right. Okay. It's always seemed to me that the fatalities issue, the bankruptcies issue, the family breakup issues, and the mortgage foreclosure issues that come out of lack of insurance coverage or the high cost, so that people don't have the money to actually avail themselves of the insurance that they have, okay, due to the copays, okay, and the deductibles. However, the fatalities always have struck me as the big issue, which even though people don't often actually think about, we went into a long and costly war, and a deadly one, especially for the Middle Eastern people, even more so, but then for our people. Over 3,000 lives that were lost. And we went to war over that. Okay. And just a few years later, okay, it was estimated that according to 2005 data, that we were losing 45,000 people per year who weren't able to have health insurance. And then in the years after that, the progressives, who are often not very good at statistics, okay, and I say that as a progressive. Okay, but I think that you were a math major, actually. So,
yes.
I expect you.
It's statistical literacy is really low in the United States across the board.
Yes, it is, and so people don't actually focus on it. But even though the population of the United States was increasing between 2005 and 2009, but nobody ever thought to suggest, well, if our numbers are increasing substantially over those over such a period of time, then perhaps the fatalities were increasing every year also. And when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, by which time, if they had passed a Medicare for All bill early in 2009, everybody would have had Medicare for All. They just passed the ACA, okay, in March of 2010, and from that time until the end of the administration, there were 356,000 fatalities due to lack of insurance, while they were in the process, okay, of implementing the Affordable Care Act. I know it's 356,000 because I estimated it actually myself, and I'll send you a copy of the paper, okay, in which I did that. Okay, but that's quite a butcher's bill And it seems to me we need to talk about that. That it's unforgivable that that is simply forgotten. And the butcher's bill continues to go on, even though the Affordable Care Act, okay, is in effect. Because the evidence is that fewer and fewer people are now being covered, that people are falling off, okay, the Affordable Care Act. That it reached its peak sometime in 2015, and people are actually leaving the system because of the high costs now. Okay, and if Trump gets to kill it and pass his own thing, then I did a projection about what the effects of that were likely to be between 2017, okay, and 2024, and of course the fatality projections there were going to be even worse than they had been under Obama. So anyway, I think that's a dynamite issue to present to somebody who is against a Medicare for All bill, as your opponent is, of course, right?
Yeah. So, but she usually just talks about how the VA is horrible and that's why we can't have single payer. I'm just like,
Yes.
well,
Yes.
we actually like it because we don't have to deal with bills.
Okay, actually, when I got into the details of the different systems, which was in 2009, okay, in 2010, because I got extremely active, okay, in writing about health insurance then, okay, in the run-up to the Affordable Care Act, which I opposed, actually, okay, because I was a Medicare for All, a diehard. There I learned that VA care and TRICARE was extremely popular with the people on it, probably more popular than Medicare in terms of the larger population. Okay, and Medicare, of course, is also extremely popular, but the most popular of the systems was actually the one closest to a national health insurance system. In other words, going even further than a Medicare for All system, being much more like the UK system as opposed to Canada's system. Okay, but that's another story, of course. Okay, so moving to your plans for the economy, please tell us about those.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, the living wage is the most essential piece. People should be able to afford to live where they work. It's particularly bad here in Vancouver, Washington. We have the highest rising rents in the nation.
Oh my God.
A living wage for a studio apartment is $18 an hour. The median wage is around $13 an hour, and we have the highest minimum wage in the country right now. For a statewide wage, and it's not enough. And people can't afford to live here. People are being priced out of their homes. We have families now living on the streets. We have senior citizens getting priced out of their homes and living on the streets. We have more than 4,000 identified homeless children in just 2 of our 30 school districts. It's just getting ridiculous. And so really,
how would you guarantee a living wage then?
But we'd have to look at where, because it takes time to implement it. You have to do it incrementally to allow the system to adjust to the increase in wages. But it would probably just be looking at the projections of what that living wage would be nationally, and then tying it to the cost of living so that we don't have to deal with this problem long term.
Okay, well, I guess I have a few comments to make on that. Okay. The first is that there's the MIT living wage calculator, which is it's a database, okay, they maintain, which compares the living wage in a particular area with the minimum wage in that area, and invariably shows, of course, that there's a huge discrepancy.
Yeah.
Between a living wage, okay, and a minimum wage. So I thought that ought to be mentioned here. Okay, but then the second thing, okay, that ought to be mentioned is that when you consider living wage, as you implied in what you just said, it's going to vary across the country. It's going to vary by local area. So how would we create a legal structure that would provide for the adjustments to a living wage that would be necessary to make it fair across the country?
I think that I don't know how much the federal government can do to create that legal structure. And I think, most of these areas have a slightly higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage when they have a higher cost of living, like Washington does, Oregon does, California does. It's a lot of, like in New York and states where the cost of living is higher, they do have a higher minimum wage. And I think that you have to, so if you bring it up to...
Right, but it still is nowhere near a living wage.
Yeah, I guess I think, because $7.25 or whatever it is now is not enough.
The federal minimum, yes.
Yeah, it's not anywhere near enough. It's half of what is currently needed for the national average. So bringing that national minimum wage up, the federal minimum wage up to a baseline that covers a large portion of the United States allows more room for for the states and local municipalities to increase their minimum wage above the national.
Okay, so here's what the federal government could do, I think. It could start a federal job guarantee program that would be funded by the federal government, but would be locally administered and controlled under the theory that it's the local areas that have an understanding of what kinds of services, activities are needed to fill the needs of the local areas. When I say it would be federally funded, I mean that the wages paid under the program would go directly to the participants, with no middle people actually skimming anything off. But the local authorities who would be administering the program would also get some payments for expenses that were necessary to do the work, which the local stakeholders would be defining. Okay, so in that case, then it would be possible for the federal government to actually define a living wage. Okay, and once it defines an average or even let's say a bottom living wage for the cheapest area inside of the country, it could go from there and use the CPI to adjust the living wage across the country. It's a fairly simple statistical adjustment. Okay, you could either use the CPI or it perhaps could use the MIT living wage indicator, but most probably after debate in Washington, it would come down to using the CPI. But that would be a pretty simple way to define, the living wage across the country, and to make it fair. Now, you've raised the question, well, there has to be an adjustment in order to give the economies a chance to adjust. To that, I would say that I'm not sure it's really a good idea or really necessary to give the Walmarts of the world, a chance to adjust. And to the extent, that it's necessary for small businesses within a particular area to adjust, then it could be possible to set up a subsidies program under the well, perhaps not under the job guarantee program, but under a supplementary bill, to provide financial assistance to those small businesses that were caught in the middle and that had to make a transition over a period of years. And the reason why that might be actually a preferable way to do it is because it doesn't give the Walmarts of the world, or other extremely large businesses with whose profits are at a record high, further years of profits while they are adjusting to the need to pay a living wage that their failure to pay that wage had been giving them unconscionable profits for years and years and years, perhaps going back as much as 40 years, when the wealthy first began to be successful in degrading our system. In other words, the moral point, that's brought up here is they've had 40 years to adjust to the situation. What they've done is to go the other way. So why should we give them any more time? Instead, we should be taking back what they took from us over those 40 years. Now, I don't know how valid that particular sentiment is, but I think it's probably got some validity to it. And so, I offered that as a counter argument to the argument that they need some time to adjust. But anyway, I don't see a federal job guarantee on your platform yet.
No, it's we are with Justice Democrats kind of working on it as a policy idea.
There are many Democrats across the country who have now gotten into the job guarantee and who are quoting wages, some, of course, $15 an hour, some as high as $18 an hour. And there's actually one in Georgia who's quoting a $20 living wage, and somebody I encountered just a few days ago who's in favor of a $22 living wage, on the assumption that it's not only the case that the living wage should have kept pace with cost of living adjustments over the 40 years, but also with productivity gains, which the working class has had no part in for about 40 years. So when that person considered both of those things, at that point, they arrived at the $22 an hour estimate. I have to say I have a lot of sympathy for that estimate.
Yeah, I think I do see definitely thinking about it as keeping up with productivity. I like this idea of looking at taxing the robots and really
Yes.
starting to make sure that people are making enough to survive and thrive. I mean, not just survive, but to thrive.
Right. I think so too. Uh, okay, the point I was making though is that there are platforms from other candidates that you could look at across the country, okay, and you would be able to evaluate and see whether they would work in your area, okay, the country. There's always the politics, okay, the local area to consider, okay, but the guy who's offering this is in the Georgia 10th district, okay, so he's just going all out in that district to give people what he thinks they need. Okay. Uh, okay, now the job guarantee could also be geared in the local areas to work on infrastructure and also green energy jobs, okay, and things like that. So the job guarantee would be able to overlap with some of the other needs that you've already defined and that you are for already. So you could blend that part of your program with the job guarantee part of your program, and it would fit, okay, I think, extremely nicely. And so far in the statement of your program, you have been vague about how the infrastructure rebuilding and the move to an energy renewables economy would occur in terms of programs, okay, and the legislation that you might favor. So this gives you a chance to get more specific about it and to go forward with that. And your next plank, well, I guess before I get to the veterans plank. Okay, well maybe we can cover that fairly quickly. You want to see veterans get treated fairly with the justice they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
And so do I. And I suspect so do most Americans. They probably hate the kinds of policies which the Republicans have been running, and to a lesser degree, the Democrats as well, though I think the Democrats have been far better than the Republicans in that one respect anyway. But of course, it's been hard for the Democrats to get anything through since 2010, when they blew that particular cycle by doing such a bad job in the first 2 years, compared to the problems that had to be met. So, okay, I think we agree on that. Is there anything specific you'd like to say there?
Well, I think there's some big issues that are happening that I don't think people are necessarily thinking about. We're deporting veterans, which is a huge, I think, problem, especially when we're deporting issues. Veterans that have been injured in war, and they deserve access to the care. Yeah. And veterans with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries who receive less than honorable discharges also can't get access to the care that they need. And so that we need to be looking and reevaluating these veterans and ensuring that that they're not paying the ultimate price.
Yes, I completely agree with you. In complete support, okay, of the ideas that you've stated there. Okay. Could you tell us something about your criminal justice reform program? Seems to me that's a very important one.
Yeah. it's it's a complicated mess. I think we're where we're trying to go with both through Justice Democrats and brand new Congress is more towards restorative justice systems that are very similar to like what they have in Scandinavian countries, where we are concentrating more on rehabilitating people and helping people get back out into society and being functioning members of society. We need to end the drug war and really tackle the racism that we see in the criminal justice system. And not just racism, but also there's a lot of penalties for poverty that happen within our criminal justice system, and entirely too much forgiveness for wealthy people.
Okay, so of course, I completely agree there too. I don't think there can be more than a single standard of justice for everyone. But also, I have to say that some of the problems that you just cited can be greatly alleviated by that very same job guarantee program. In other words, if people coming out of prison could find a job under the job guarantee program, which they would be able to do, and that job were at a living wage, which they've never been able to find before, then I think the recidivism rate would just crash. And problems, of opioid addiction also would be far, far less, because people coming out of incarceration would be able to envision a life and very quickly have a life and be integrated within a social structure, and doing work that was satisfying and that they had a part in structuring, because the job guarantee program actually would operate in that way. It would be very participatory from the bottom up, at least in terms of designs that I favor for it. So that handles, or as I say, it really greatly alleviates quite a number of the problems that you're talking about here with respect to criminal justice and the opioid problem, and also the problem of integrating immigrants fully into our society. It must be very hard for immigrants now, but because they are down at the bottom, they get the worst jobs. Those jobs, are intermittent, but very frequently. And it's probably very hard for them to keep things together and to be in the shadows. But a federal job guarantee program could employ all the people who've come here and could give them lives too, because the program would be oriented towards things that have to be done in local areas across the country. And these would be useful things that the communities that would be doing the jobs had to neglect for years and years and years. so that in places like the middle of Kentucky, for example, and lots of other rural areas in the country where the economy is suffering or virtually dead, there would be this sudden huge influx, okay, of money into the economy. The cost of the job guarantee program per year at the start would probably be on the order of $600 billion to $650 billion per year. Which leads me to my next question. And that question is, if you were for all the programs that you envision here and the expenditures, okay, that you envision, such as the $4.6 trillion expenditure in infrastructure, and I notice you don't even estimate what the transitions cost to a renewable economy actually would be, that somebody somewhere, probably the Republican, is going to ask you how you're going to pay for it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you that question now because somebody sooner or later, okay, is going to ask it. Okay, so how are you going to pay for it?
Well, a lot of these things like infrastructure investment in education, and investment in science and technology all have a positive return. So they pay for themselves.
Uh-oh.
And that's
okay. Okay, in terms of the initial outlay of federal funds, they do not pay for themselves. That is, the federal funds have to be laid out, and they have to be financed in some way. In the longer run, they may have to pay for themselves, but if you're talking about financially paying for themselves, then there has to be a source that creates the money that pays for them continuously. And the only source we have, okay, in our society that creates any money as a net financial asset, as opposed to debt, is, of course, the federal government. So the question, okay, I'm really asking you is, how are you going to manage, okay, and that's assuming, okay, progressives had control of Congress, then what kinds of arrangements would you put in, okay, in order to pay for these programs? I think that's a fair question.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a fair question too. But I think, like, right now we're leveraging debt in this country in order to fight these stupid wars. So we just added like another $85 billion to our war budget, and that's,
yes, we did.
We're having to. So if we're going to leverage debt, we should be leveraging it for something that has a positive return on the investment in a way that benefits society.
Yes, but if you go at this essentially through leveraging debt, okay, or issuing debt, okay, then your opposition, okay, and even assuming, okay, a progressive Congress, there's a wider world out there, and especially in Washington, there's a whole industry devoted to terrorism over the issue of the public debt. They're screaming right now that the debt is up to, what is it, 20.5 trillion, 21.5 trillion? I don't know. Okay, I got to look it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Which our poor grandchildren are going to have to pay, or our children, okay, are going to have to pay. And eventually, according to them, it has to be paid by tax revenues that, of course, are gathered from us, because God forbid they should be taxing the rich. But anyway, that is so much money that the rich couldn't cover it either. So this raises a question: do you understand how, in fact, it can be paid for?
Well, honestly, we don't need to be so worried about the debt. It's a big number now because of the scale of things. But like with World War II, we ran up the debt to 100% of our GDP.
It was greater than that. It was actually at one point 125% of GDP.
And that's about where we're at right now, is around 100% of our GDP.
We're at 100%, of GDP, mm-hmm. which is still considerably less than 125%.
Yeah. So we still have some room to grow, right, and be able to deal with it. But the problem is that we're not focusing on that, right? We're not focusing on how do we create economic growth? How do we increase revenue? How do we create an economic system that is having good, steady growth? I think that we just need to not be so fretting about the deficit and the debt, and be fretting more about how we're spending that money, because right now we're wasting it.
Okay. So the first thing I'll say about this is that I agree the debt is of no consequence. The size of the debt and the debt to GDP ratio do not affect the fiscal sustainability of a government with a fiat sovereign currency, such as the United States. This is a fact. But you will probably have a hell of a time explaining that one to the public at large. And there will be continual propaganda battles over this. If you, and other progressives are successful, and get into Congress, the mad dogs will be yipping at your heels during the whole tenure in Congress, trying to relate every mistake that you make to the fact that the debt is rising fast. Because most probably, to maintain a full employment economy, you may have to run fiscal deficits continuously of 10% of GDP. The reason why I say continuously is because you have leakages of demand from the economy every year that have to be made up to maintain the economy, to maintain the growth. These leakages are due to private savings. When people want to save money, they sock that money away. They do not consume. And the better off they get, the less they consume, generally speaking. Okay. And the second factor is we import a lot more than we export. I'm not talking about the absolute numbers now, which sound like they're extremely large, but they're actually fairly low compared to what we imported at the height, of our imports. We're now probably running a trade deficit of something like maybe 3%. At its high point, during the Bush administration, I think we were up to 6.5%. So as a percent of GDP, it was double what we're doing now. Okay, that is money that leaks out of the economy that basically, in large part, goes into treasury notes, which are resident at the Federal Reserve, held by foreign governments. In other words, that money really doesn't go to China. It goes to the Federal Reserve in the form of Treasury there. Okay, but in any case, it's not spent in the economy. So as our economy gets stronger and stronger, it'll be moving up to the 6% level. And as a percent of GDP, our savings will probably be moving up to 6% level of GDP. So between 10 and 12% will be leaking out of the economy each year. To compensate for it, it's necessary for deficit spending by the government to be high enough to compensate for it. Now, in recent years, this has never been the case. Our deficits have always been too small. Even the Obama deficits of $1 trillion were too small compared to what needed to be spent at that time. We consistently are way, way under. Okay. When Obama quit, we had deficits that was $600 billion. They should have been $2 trillion. So Trump is raising them to $1 trillion now. They're still $1 trillion or more short of where they ought to be. Okay, in other words, new money pumped into the economy by the federal government. Okay, so you may have to run these extremely large deficits. Now, you've got things to spend them on, like the infrastructure. I mean, good things like the infrastructure, the shift to the new energy foundations, the Medicare for all of these things are great public purpose things to spend on. Okay, so you can do all that. Okay, but the point is, you do have to know how to pay for it. So there's a very simple way, and I'm not going to go into the details now because we are running out of time. But what it basically comes down to, okay, is what's on this slide, and I'll put it on solo, okay, so you can read it. Okay, if someone asks you, your programs look expensive, how are you going to pay for them? The fundamental answer is, the soundbite answer is, we're Congress. We'll just order the Fed to give Treasury the money. That is, in fact, the real solution to how you're going to pay for it. Now, I also have the legislative language for that, to make that happen. It's 2 sentences. It can be placed in every appropriations bill. It can be placed in every CR bill that goes through the Congress. And then the Treasury would immediately have the money that you in Congress are ordering the Treasury to spend. And when you appropriate something, it's a mandate for the Treasury to spend. Okay, it's not voluntary, it's a mandate. Okay, so the point being that if you include that language in bills, there's no more need to issue any debt instruments. All of the national debt will be paid off over time. Within 6 months, it would be clear that for good and all, the national debt issue is dead, not there. All the money would also be there to spend for the programs that you passed. Okay, it would all be there. All the language I spoke of is online now in the 116th Congress group, okay, that you are now a member of. So you can find the language there. I have also 2 slides with slightly more detailed language, other than the very simple one-liner, okay, I've given you here. I've given you some 2-liners and some 4-liners, okay, to use. And then I've also given you a slide with the I suppose an approximation, but to the legislative language that would be more finely crafted by the lawyers in Congress. Okay, so anyway, that's something that you could could look at, and I really think it ends the debt issue, okay, as something that can be harmful to progressives, and that when you go into debates against people, okay, and they give you that question, and you give them one of the short answers that you can give in a debate, they won't know what to say in reply. They just won't know what to say because it does answer the question. Okay, would you like to make a final statement? We have a few moments left, and then I have to get off here because Victor Tiffany has a broadcast that he is coming up with, okay, at 9:30. So I have a hard deadline tonight. But if you'd like to come back sometime, I'd love to have you back. And we could do it fairly soon if you'd like to, but within a few weeks.
All right.
Would you like to summarize for tonight?
So just let people know they can check out our campaign on dorothyforcongress.com. Follow us on Facebook at Dorothy4 Congress, and on Twitter is Dorothy4 House. And just really kind of hope people can get involved in a progressive campaign somewhere. If you sign up to be a monthly donor to our campaign, we have bricks on our wall that you actually will put your name, and you can be a permanent part of our headquarters.
Have you got a donation button that you'd like people to link to?
Yeah, so there's one on our campaign page, so on our website at Dorothy for Congress. Just hit the contribute button. There's two options. You can either sign up through ActBlue or CrowdPack if you don't want to pay through ActBlue.
Okay. Okay, and would you like to make a summary statement?
Just, I don't know. We already covered a lot, but just really, we're doing everything we can here to win this race and flip it for a progressive. We do have a lot of pressure from the establishment on the Democratic side, so any help that we can get, we really need to help defeat them. You can volunteer remotely through our campaign. Just fill out the volunteer form on our website, or donations are always helpful, especially those monthly reoccurring donors.
Okay, I did actually neglect to something that I did want to get to briefly at least. Okay, you cited protecting the Bill of Rights as something, that's very important to you. Okay, and it's very important to me too. So I'd like to get some of your thoughts there.
Well, currently the ones that are the most at risk are the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. The government has really been overstepping its bounds on invading our privacy, and especially digitally.
Okay, and also the private companies as well. However, the private companies are not covered under the Constitution, but they're supposed to be covered by the Congress. In other words, the Congress ought to be able to legislate those particular dangers away. Okay, but also, don't you think that the First Amendment is also greatly under threat?
Well, there definitely has been some legislative efforts to threaten the First Amendment, and the fact that a lot of our congressional representatives are avoiding their constituents eliminates our ability to address government. So that's really kind of, there definitely are some issues with the First, the Fourth, the Fifth.
Yeah, what really bothers me about the First Amendment, okay, of course, I'm very exercised because I think there are threats to freedom of the press. But also for years, I think freedom of speech, okay, and freedom of assembly have been routinely violated at the local level with federal cooperation, okay, and also federal blessing. And I don't see what the local police have been doing to break up the protest activities, okay, and demonstration. I don't see how that could ever be considered to be constitutional.
It's not. It's been pretty bad, I think, in Portland, Oregon, which is right across the river from us.
Yes, I know.
We've seen a lot of issues, and there's studies now showing that when the police come in aggressive, that they create this sense of aggression, and they're the reason why a lot of these protests are turning violent.
Is it so much the protests are turning violent, or that there are responses to police violence?
Well, I think that's what it is. It's a response to police violence. It's a response to that aggressive behavior that the police bring when they come in. Here on our side of the river, our police, especially the Vancouver police and the city of Vancouver, is very friendly to First Amendment expressions of the First Amendment. And so we don't see that level of stress between the police and protesters. They generally just want to get a heads up about what we're doing, and then if we're marching, to ensure the police are there to keep people safe and to deal with traffic. Other than that, it's free, and that's the way it should be. You shouldn't have to have a permit.
Yes, that is the way it should be. Yes, of course. During the time of the Occupy movement in some of the major cities, it wasn't so free at all. And that was very distressing. And we still see some violence happening across the country in some of the newer demonstrations, okay, as well. Okay, so I have to get off here, and you probably have to get off here also. Okay, so I'm going to let you go, and I thank you very much for coming and for listening to some of my notions.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sure. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, so as I said, it is time for me to go. And thank you for coming. I think our attendance was fairly good all night, as far as I can see. I'd like to remind you that Real Progressives has a Patreon account, and from time to time, if you would go to the Patreon account, okay, and but be generous, we would be very grateful. And I too have a Patreon account under Joe Firestone at Patreon. Okay, and of course, I too would be very grateful if you were so inclined to become a patron. Okay. And by the way, I want to thank the patrons that I have now. I'm very grateful for your efforts. Okay. And for the rest of my watchers, but once again, but thank you very much for coming. And I'll see you again on Thursday night when we have Bill Cimbrello from Massachusetts coming on as our guest. He is running for Congress. Okay, so I will see you then, and good night.